Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Paul Cowlins, naturopathic physician and former professor of naturopathic medicine in Portland, Oregon. And welcome back to my series on salutogenic terrain medicine, where I explore paradigms and ways of knowing and used in biology and medicine, including so-called natural medicine, in order to deepen our understanding of the human being and our understanding of health and disease. Please don't forget to share, like, and subscribe if you find this content valuable. And this is the fifth lecture in the series. I'll put a link to the previous lecture in the description below, so be sure to watch that, maybe to give some more background to what I'll be talking about today. The central premise I've been working with is that there's always a subjective element in the act of perception, even in the so-called objective sciences such as modern medicine or biomedicine. In the background of our minds, we hold organizing ideas, largely unconscious, that take the form of paradigms. These include our conceptual models, and these are often based on simpler metaphors taken from our experiences in nature. These paradigms only allow us to effectively see a portion of the phenomena we're observing, whether it be a natural phenomena or the human being itself. The paradigms, of course, are extremely helpful in organizing and making sense of the data that we gather and what we observe, and they help us act upon those observations. So, for example, a healthcare provider arriving at a diagnosis of the patient and choosing the appropriate treatment. But unfortunately, they also act as cognitive biases. They limit us into only seeing one aspect of a phenomenon. In the case of medicine, our current biomedical paradigm really limits our understanding to only one dimension of the human being, one dimension of what's fully possible if we include other ways of knowing. And I've been arguing that increasingly many so-called natural, functional, or integrative trends in medicine are simply adopting the biomedical paradigm to describe the use of natural products and therapies rather than putting forth any sort of original or fresh way of thinking about the nature of health and disease, or providing us with a fundamentally different understanding of the human being, differing from the current biomedical paradigm. I would argue that a truly integrative medicine would include these additional dimensions not currently worked with the current biomedical paradigm. And to create such a medicine requires that we really develop a new paradigm. We need to think outside the box. And these new paradigms, or this new paradigm, would essentially require an expanded epistemology, or ways of knowing, as well as an expanded ontology, or understanding of the fundamental basis of nature and the human being. And I've been developing the premise here that only in this way, through this expanded paradigm, can we develop a truly integrative medicine. Not one that just falls back on tradition or stands apart or aside or separate from the biomedical model, but is integrated with fully the biomedical model and sees the biomedical paradigm as a subset of the total paradigm that we can develop in medicine. Historically, there have been many philosophers and thinkers who have deeply examined these ways of knowing and all the ways of knowing that we use to gain knowledge of the world and human beings. I mentioned the work of the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner in the late early 1900s. He's the founder of so-called anthroposophy. Steiner was very much interested in the act of perception and ways of knowing, and developed a whole sort of expanded approach to science, which he called spiritual science, which took into consideration more subtle dimensions that are not part of the discourse. Steiner himself based a lot of his early work on the earlier developments by the German poet and playwright Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe, very famous figure in the late 17, early 1800s in Germany. He dedicated a large, or he was, we could say, most proud of the work that he did in regards to putting forth a alternative approach to doing science, what he called more of an organic approach. And he developed what he referred to as a delicate empiricism that would supplement or extend the then developing empirical methods of science. The early 20th century also saw a number of so-called phenomenologists who studied this relationship between the observer and what's observed and looked at different ways of knowing. And I mentioned one particular helpful sort of model we can use to look at for specific ways of knowing is to go back and look at the concept from the ancient Greek world, the idea that there are four elements in nature, or that we can find four fundamental processes in nature, and that if we look at this as not so much a description of processes, but more as descriptions of our states of consciousness, the ancient Greeks would have said fundamentally that we have four different modes of knowing available to us, and that these modes of knowing allow us to see different aspects of nature. So the four modes of knowing, as I reviewed in the last couple of lectures, would be the earth or solid way of knowing, the so-called intellectual analytical mode of consciousness, which allows us, when observing the human being, to perceive our physical organization. And I'll talk more in detail about that today. A second mode would be the water fluidic way of knowing, or imaginative synthetic consciousness, which allows us to perceive our fluid organization and the different processes that are active in that fluid organization. A third way of knowing would be an air gas or inspirative feeling type of consciousness, and this would allow perception of what we might refer to as the air gas and inner light body, which I'll again be going into more detail in coming up lectures. And then fourthly, a fire, warmth, intuitive, poetic way of knowing, which allows for perception of what one might refer to as the warmth organization. So a human being essentially has four distinct levels of organization that can be studied and examined with these different ways of knowing. And as I mentioned in a previous lecture, the ancient Greek might have said, well, we are, with our current biomedical models, very good at looking at Earth. We have dissected Earth into many pieces, and we understand the more and more increasingly the different relationships between those pieces, but we are missing essentially 3/4 of the human being when we don't include these other types of cognition. So I want to focus today's lecture on the physical organization and then start the discussion on the fluidic organization, which will require a couple of lectures to go through. So the physical organization is something that I think if anybody has gone through a healthcare training program or studied physiology or anatomy in school, this is essentially studying the physical level of organization. And that's perceived through the intellectual analytical consciousness, which we're all very familiar with in the sciences. And if people have been brought up in a sort of Western education system, this is usually what is ingrained in those ways of thinking. Earth thinking allows for perception of spatial structures. So our anatomy, our physical form, and all of those things like the skeleton, the muscles, the nerves, and all of those things studied often in a gross anatomy or cadaver lab, where we look at dead bodies and look at all these pieces because they're easier to sort of study in that context. But we can extend that also into clinical practice, where things like physical imaging are looking at the perception of spatial structures. And even down to the molecular level, to say that molecules really are little pieces of Earth. The Earth thinking apply to the processes and phenomena we see in biochemistry and life activities. We, of course, just intuitively or we instinctively associate the molecules with life, but to be strictly honest, we would say that really the life processes are something in and of themselves, and the molecules are one aspect of that. So the molecular pathways that are drawn out in the textbooks and whatnot are one aspect of life, but not necessarily life itself. It is a way of taking Earth thinking to life activity, which I'll speak more about today. It's something that really exists more in the fluidic realm through time. And we take that and we look at the spatial element of life, and that gives us our current molecular, biological, and genetic view of the organism. Even things in the clinic like biomarker testing, where we're looking at molecules to indicate disease states or health states. These are, we might argue, the corpses of life activity that we can examine. Thinking in terms of molecular substances is really Earth thinking. So it's what it studies, Earth thinking studies what is already formed and what's dead. And when we study organisms in their development, embryological development, we realize that what is solid, what is so-called Earth, is actually the last to form. That really there are fluidic processes, and before that even more subtle gaseous and even warmth processes at work guiding the fluid. But the fluid processes as if precipitate out. So in the embryologic development of the heart I mentioned in the last lecture, it's very interesting that there's a streaming in the embryo before the heart begins to beat. And that streaming is filled with different cells, which are precursors to red blood cells, as well as the cells that line your blood vessels called endothelium. and these cells begin to precipitate out along the boundaries of the streaming, and they eventually then form the blood vessels in the chambers of the heart itself, so that what we see as solid, the blood vessels in the heart, actually came from a fluidic state. But earth thinking studies what has already formed, that solid aspect. So it's corpse thinking, and it's interesting to think about how the majority of our molecular and genetic knowledge in medicine has come from killing beings, pulverizing them, mashing them up, putting them in centrifuges, and then extracting out the different parts and then trying to piece them together. Again, this is another aspect of earth thinking. Now, the laws of earth, the laws that govern the physical body, which I alluded to, we could say this is really the laws of the mineral world, or the mineral body. These are the laws of physics and chemistry. And so if we look at chemical bonding, electrostatic attractions, covalent ionic bonding, these different things, these all drive the life activities. And they're very much based on sort of ideas from classical physics, more of a sort of one thing bumping into another, causing another thing. So there's a material substrate that carries these activities. And if we look at discussions currently about life activities, you might hear things like people talking about ATP and energy production in mitochondria. So we assume the energy of life and all this really are material things, and we focus on those. As I'll show today, there's another maybe aspect we are not focusing on that we could. A third aspect besides physics and chemistry is an extension of physics, and that's thermodynamics. So the mineral body, the corpse body, what's already formed, is really subject to the forces of entropy or increasing disorder. And so that's, we can say, a characteristic of the mineral world. What's interesting about life activities, as I'll go into today, is that they seem to, at least within the organism, now as a whole, if we look at the whole environment, we have this law, this so-called second law of thermodynamics, which says that everything is tending towards greater disorder. But within the boundaries of an organism, there is a reversal of that. There's essentially greater order. And there's various ways physicists explain that today in the case of life, that there's an energy flow through life. The ultimate end result in the environment is more disorder. However, within an organism, everything is more highly ordered and structured. And so that is a property known as neg-entropy. But in the mineral world, entropy predominates. And so that's really what the physical body is subject to, is entropy. Now, from an earth perspective, pharmacology really would be the conventional pharmacologic model based on molecular substances and then how the body deals with those substances and what those substances do to the body. And this is so-called pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. So the pharmacokinetics looks at how we absorb things, how much gets into our bloodstream, how we metabolize it, how it gets to the tissues, then how we eliminate it. And then the pharmacodynamics looks at things like so-called receptor-ligand interactions, how a molecule binds to something and changes an intercellular event or a biochemical outcome. So again, the focus is very much on molecules. And then even, as I said, natural medicines are adopting this model and saying that really herbs, for example, work through the molecules in the herb. So we have to think about so-called bioavailability. Let's get more of those molecules in the system according to this way of thinking. The metaphors based on earth are really the, number one, the warfare metaphor. When it comes to disease, we see disease as a distinct entity that has to be fought and suppressed in some way. A second metaphor really, though, is the body as machine. That really this is specifically a so-called classical machine working according to the laws of classical physics. It's a machine made of cells, and these cells have smaller components going right down into the gene. So the focus here is really the machine kind of orientation and the ways we can study machines, which are really built of like gears and mineral parts. And we start to think about things like organs as just replaceable. We can replace the liver and the kidney and so on and so forth, and swap out parts, basically. So that's machine type of thinking. And there's sort of a fix-it mentality with that. Disease is a breakdown in the machine and the mechanism, so let's figure out a way to either suppress an abnormal mechanism or somehow fix that broken mechanism, maybe with adding a missing molecule or activating a certain gene, or maybe throwing in a vitamin or a natural product. So that's that sort of mentality. So this is all the physical body, which comes to us through earth cognition. Now what I want to focus on today more is the fluid body, which comes to us through fluid cognition. And this is the water or fluid, or instead of mineral, we might call this plant cognition, thinking like a plant. It's a different way of thinking than a mineral. Minerals build by just adding one atom on top of another, and from the knowledge of the atoms composing a mineral or a crystal, we can pretty much understand how that crystal or mineral is going to behave. That's not the case with living organisms. Just knowing all the atoms and molecules that form an organism, we don't know how they're going to organize themselves. They organize themselves into patterns that we can't predict from the genome or from those parts themselves. So something more is coming out here. And this is where there's a different type of thinking that's required to perceive that. If we look at the nature of water, water, of course, we see is not something that is solid and fixed like a mineral. It flows. It takes the shape of whatever container or basin it's in. There are waves, and it's spread out. In other words, if you dissolve something in water, it sort of dissolves into the whole and no longer is an isolated entity, but becomes part of a whole. So there's a wholeness aspect to that. Water is also very open to the environment. So if you think of a lake or the ocean, it's open to the waves and the sun, and that changes the patterns within the water. And if we look at how water flows, it's never in straight lines. It's always wavy. There are vortices and curves and whatnot. Very different than the linear mineral world, which often we see straight lines, sheer planes and faces and minerals and things like that. Now, of course, without water, we wouldn't have life. So we need a liquid medium for life to occur. All the proteins, the electrolytes, growth factors, hormones, etc., are dissolved in a liquid medium. And this is where our life activities occur, and that would include things like anabolism, building up of molecules, or catabolism, breaking them down. That's collectively known as metabolism. And then we have our repair, regeneration, growth, reproduction, nourishment, all these different activities occurring that we can say is our life activities. They help to keep us young and healthy and repaired. Great interest now in anti-aging medicine. How do we stimulate these growth life processes? And interestingly, how that's often being approached now is which molecule can do that, which material physical thing is the magic anti-aging pill. One other aspect of life, being in the liquid medium, is it's very open to rhythms. And so these rhythms, almost like fluid-like waves, go through the body. If we look at how the blood and the lymph and whatnot moves, it's through a streaming motion. And that is the nature of the life body. When an organism dies, then all that rhythmic activity disappears. So one simple answer to the question, what is life, is to say life is a rhythm. And when the rhythm breaks down, then we have disorder, disease, or death. So it's not so much that life is a molecule. There are, of course, molecular aspects to life, but that life itself is a rhythm and a breakdown of the rhythm. So that clinically is an interesting point to go to, is to say, well, how can I experience the rhythms in the clinic as a practitioner working with a patient, for instance? What are the rhythms in that patient? And that could be their breathing rhythm, their circulatory rhythm, but also more subtle rhythms, feeling their pulse, looking at the rhythms, holding any tissue, you'll feel a certain inner rhythm there. And so, and cerebral spinal fluid rhythms, of course. So these would all be the rhythms in the fluid body. Now, water is a physical substance in nature in general. It's very interesting. So we, of course, learn in school that water is H2O. It's an oxygen molecule with two hydrogens covalently bonded to it. But because the oxygen pulls electrons a little strongly towards it, it takes on a negative charge, and the hydrogens have a little less negative charge, so they become positively charged. Water is what we call a polar molecule. And because of that, water can form what are called hydrogen bonds. So, for example, the hydrogen positively charged end of one water molecule can be attracted to the negatively charged end of the oxygen on another water molecule, and this is a so-called hydrogen bond. And so we can see in water there are these vast networks of hydrogen bonds. In the fluid state, they're constantly shifting and moving, and then when we have gas, they dissipate off and the bonding is less and less prevalent. But then when the water solidifies into ice, the bonds are very strong. And this gives a lot of these hydrogen bonding gives water incredibly anomalous properties for a molecule of its size. So for example, water molecules, when they freeze, are actually less dense than liquid water, so they float. That's not true of any other molecule the size of water. it becomes more dense, these other molecules like carbon dioxide when they become solid. And so this property of water, of ice floating on water, is going to, for example, in lakes and ponds, create a thermal barrier that can protect the developing life underneath it. So this is just one of many different anomalous properties of water. There's lots of interesting websites and discussions around this online. One person to maybe investigate if you're interested in this is Martin Chaplin. Chaplin has, I believe, a website, but a number of articles, and I'll link one below, about this idea of the anomalous properties of water. Now that hydrogen bonding allows water to also attach closely through hydrogen bonding to charged surfaces. And if we look in living organisms inside the cell or outside the cell, it is loaded with proteins, and these proteins usually have mostly negative charges, such as collagen. And so what happens is the water forms these layers where we have water molecules lining up and coating proteins. Now, so these surfaces are essentially what we call hydrophilic surfaces, and so water lines up around the hydrophilic surfaces. For things like fats and whatnot, the water forms cages or clathrates around that substance. But in terms of hydrophilic or charged surfaces, water will form these so-called hydration layers. Now, this brings us to a very interesting phenomena that's been known about for a while, but has been studied in more depth more recently, specifically by an engineer, a biomedical engineer at the University of Washington. His name is Gerald Pollack. Many of you listening to this have probably heard of Dr. Pollack's work, and I'll put a link to his lab and website below. But basically, Pollack studied these hydration shells, and for a long time it was assumed that the hydration shells only extended maybe 1, 2, or 3, or maybe a few water molecule layers outside of a protein. But what Pollack found is that these hydration layers extend far beyond the edge of a protein, and they create a special zone of water that's very structured around the proteins in the body. And if we look inside the average cell, it is so packed full of protein, there is really no water that is not found in these hydration layers. And in that state, the water takes on a gel-like consistency. And so Pollack, and he was taking a lot of his observations from previous researchers such as Gilbert Ling, discovered that really in biological organisms, structured water is the norm. And this is different than what he called bulk water. So bulk water, like in a glass of water, just randomly hydrogen bonds breaking, reforming every millisecond. But in organisms, these charged surfaces create all of these very structured water structures around them. And when he studied these hydration layers more closely, he found that the water, the basic molecular composition of that water is not H2O, but H3O2. And that the water molecules line up in little hexagons, and they form these hexagonal patterns. And that these patterns then line up in many, many deep layers around these hydrophilic or charged surfaces. And these surfaces exclude ions and other things. And so he called this zone of water, structured water around proteins and hydrophilic surfaces, easy or exclusion zone water. And what he found was that basically easy water is the most common type of water in organisms, and that easy water has all sorts of interesting anomalous properties. And again, this is different from so-called bulk water. So most water that we drink eventually becomes organized into easy water within our cells, but also in the extracellular matrix. And that forms a sort of jelly-like consistency within us. So that is easy water. Now, some of the anomalous properties that Pollack discovered is that, first of all, easy water has lower entropy. It's more highly organized. Secondly, it's more difficult to freeze. So this prevents, for example, freezing of trees and whatnot. When normal bulk water would freeze, the water that's structured in plants, like tall trees, is found in this easy form, and that does not freeze as easily. Another thing is that these easy water structures can undergo what are called phase transitions, going from that jelly to a more liquid state and back and forth. And that can work as sort of an engine of sorts to drive different cellular processes. And Pollack wrote many years ago a book called Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life, which I'll link below. where he describes how maybe just looking at the water can explain things such as muscle contraction, which is still really the current so-called sliding filament theory is still a theory. It's widely accepted, but there's still some anomalous things that haven't been explained that he proposes understanding the transitions between water that is highly structured and bulk water could explain muscle movement, as well as charge separation within cells. One of the very interesting things about easy water is that it takes on a negative charge. Compared to the surrounding bulk water and just outside the easy water zone, there's a zone of protons or positive charge. So essentially, having structured water stores charge, and this acts as a sort of water battery that our physiology can draw energy from. And interestingly, when we talk about cellular energy, it's often talked about ATP and how ATP is really the driver of cellular energy. Well, what Pollack found is that ATP charges up, makes larger, easy water structures around proteins, especially in our cells. So essentially, ATP is helping to create more easy water, which is then the storage form of that energy. So it's another source, potentially, of energy within the cell. And that's a very important, that cellular electricity aspect, a very important aspect of easy water. Now, another interesting phenomena about easy water is that it's very sensitive to the environment. And so one of Pollack's co-workers discovered that actually infrared light is able to charge up and build easy water structures. And so just being in sunlight, for instance, charges up the easy water within us. One interesting phenomena is that there's easy water on the inside lining of our blood vessels, which prevents, according to Pollack and others, which actually prevents blood cells from clumping to the walls of blood vessels, but also facilitates the streaming of blood through capillaries, independent of the pressure from the heart. So just having easy water in the charge separation creates circulatory flow. And when we're in sunlight absorbing infrared light, we build up those easy water structures and then improve circulation. So there's a lot of discussion about vitamin D in sunlight, certainly important, but also we need the infrared to charge up our easy water to produce more cellular electricity, but also improve circulation. And the same could happen with an infrared sauna or any other source of infrared lights and so forth. So that's another interesting property. Now, although Pollack doesn't discuss this, I think that opens up the interesting question, is easy water also open to more subtle influences? For example, subtle changes in magnetic fields in the Earth's environment. Changes, for example, related to magnetic field intensity changes related to the lunar cycle and potential other planetary cycles. So could the easy water be a sensitive medium, a receiver for those environmental influences? Another aspect too, which Pollack I think just touches upon and others have gone into in more depth, and I'm not going to spend too much time here talking about it, is the idea that easy water can hold memory, can hold information. And this goes to that question of the so-called memory of water, which is a very controversial subject. Those of you familiar with homeopathy might have heard of these discussions. I think that needs a whole separate discussion, and if there are people out there interested in that, I can do an episode on that as well. So that's the work of Pollack with easy water, finding that the majority of our water in the organism is structured highly. Now, the second researcher I want to bring in is a woman from Hong Kong, a biophysicist. Her name is Mae Wan Ho. Mae Wan Ho was born in 1941. She died in 2016. And she started her career in biology at the time when DNA, the whole structure of DNA was discovered. And when we were going more in biology towards the methods of molecular biology and genetics. And she was very disappointed with this increasing trend in reductionism at her time. And so instead she started thinking about the bigger questions of what is life, but also how does biophysics play in with organisms? And so she spent many, many years researching these different questions. The question of what is life, she actually based that off of a book written by Erwin Schrödinger, who is a quantum physicist. He was the one that formulated the so-called Schrödinger wave equation. Some people maybe heard of Schrödinger's cat or kitten. So Schrödinger wrote this book, What is Life?, before we knew the actual structure of DNA. And he asked, why is it that life seems to be different than the laws of classical physics. For example, that living organisms have this negative entropy, that they highly organize. That goes against traditional thinking in thermodynamics and in physics. And so he asked, could we use physics and chemistry to understand life? And if so, do we have to augment physics and chemistry? Do we have to, for example, use the laws of quantum physics and chemistry to understand life? And his proposal was largely left unanswered. And then Mae Wan Ho really took this up starting in the 1980s and 90s and took this further. She was also influenced by other physicists, Herbert Froelich, Fritz Albert Popp, who I'll be saying more about in an upcoming lecture, and then Kenneth Denbigh, who's a thermodynamicist. And so, basically she came to this conclusion that life is much more than just DNA, for example, that it's not just molecular, that there is biophysical aspects to life that current research is neglecting. And so her interest really was in studying the thermodynamics of living organisms, as well as the quantum chemistry of those organisms. And her key idea is that life is an activity that captures and stores energy and mobilizes it quantum coherently. And I'll need to say more about what that means. Quantum coherently in a perfectly coupled cycles that generate no entropy. So this was her definition of life. And I'll include an article of a sort of an interview with her below where she discusses this in more detail. And I'll include links to her books. Two very important books that she wrote was The Rainbow in the Worm and Living Rainbow H2O. It was a follow-up from that based on the physics of water in living organisms. Now, I have to say a little bit about this notion of quantum in medicine. There's a lot of controversy about this. When we talk about quantum, really we're talking technically about the subatomic world and the laws of that world, which are very bizarre. They include different types of laws that differ from the laws of classical physics, what we tend to see in the so-called macroscopic world. So for example, if we start to study subatomic particles, they have sort of a dual aspect to them. They have a particulate aspect and a wave-like aspect, depending on how we observe them. They also can be spread out in space or non-local, unlike a particle, which is occupying a certain part of space. Particles, in the quantum sense, can become entangled, and then no matter how far you separate them, changing the nature of one will change the other instantaneously, faster than any sort of speed of light signal can go between them, suggesting that quantum particles are united in a higher dimension, all as one. And then different things like quantum tunneling, where electrons can go through energy barriers that would not be possible in classical physics and chemistry. And then finally, this idea of quantum coherence, which I'll be speaking about shortly here. So the essential point is that quantum, when we say quantum in medicine, that the quantum rules are different from the rules of classical rules. So for example, in the quantum realm, energy and information can be transferred not in this sort of billiard ball-like way, like in the classical sense, but rather through instantaneous transfer of energy and information through, for example, water, which I'll say about here in just shortly. So in the quantum sense, there's a different way of transferring information, not based on this material push-pull type interactions. We'd also, when we think quantumly, we have to start thinking in terms of waves. Now, the waves are very weird in quantum physics. A lot of people talk about the wave-particle duality. Waves of what? They're matter waves, but they're actually based on probability. So they're waves in a so-called complex number space. And so they're not really waves like ocean waves or whatnot. It's very hard to grasp. But basically, it says that these waves are not of this dimension. Mathematically, they're coming from another dimension. Of course, we say that's just a useful tool to help us calculate, but could it be that dimension is real? And that we've actually measured it through our understanding of complex numbers, for instance. In quantum phenomena, we can have a phenomena of so-called resonance transfer of energy. We match frequencies and energies transferred right away between two particles. If it was found that quantum ideas, quantum physics was true in living organisms, it would essentially revolutionize how we think about pharmacology, physiology, everything else. And so the big controversy is, do quantum effects occur at the macroscopic level, especially in the wet, noisy, warm environment of a cell? And for many, many years, people, physicists in particular, said, no, it's not possible, for example, to create quantum effects at a large scale amongst atoms and molecules. You need to cool it to extremely cold temperatures to form what's called a Bose-Einstein condensate. You have to cool things down to nearly absolute zero. That doesn't happen in living organisms. They're too wet, noisy, there's a lot of activity going on. Well, it turns out that since Mae Wan Ho's time, and with her research, but then subsequent research, we found that indeed quantum effects do occur at a macroscopic level in living organisms, and that is just now being worked out further. Again, this is all a little different than talking about the quantum that many people talk about of quantum healing, which involves more consciousness, our effect of thoughts on things, which is another aspect that I'm not going to get into here. So we can talk about a narrow quantum and a broad, more speculative quantum. I'm talking more about the narrow quantum. Mae Wan Ho's work and her colleagues and the people that she worked and studied with, really this work has been well published, it's reproducible, and so this is following the sort of methods of science in this way. So Mae Wan Ho really studied the organisms, and especially the liquid crystalline water, the easy water. She had a different name, this is before Pollack's work, the liquid crystalline water, and that she found that this essentially enables noiseless, rapid intercommunication between cells, between matter within the organisms to take place. And this is what is characteristic of what are called quantum coherent systems. So I need to talk about quantum coherence here. Now again, this research was very revolutionary back in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s, but now it's actually become more mainstream, and there are actually departments of quantum biology studying quantum chemistry and effects, for example, in photosynthesis, in smelling, olfaction, as well as in animal migration, how animals orient to magnetic fields. These all likely involve quantum processes at a large scale, fairly large scale. And so there's an interesting book I'll link below called Life on the Edge, written by a quantum biologist, a physicist who has really spent his career studying this. Now, key concepts for Mae Wan Ho here, which are relevant to the water fluid organization, is that, again, the fluids in the body, because they are all aligned in a certain way as a liquid crystal, they move coherently together. And there can be waves that tie them all together. And from the quantum mechanical sense, they are actually one whole. That even though they're made up of individual molecules, they behave as a collective, as a whole. And this is quantum coherence. All these particles are entangled in a way. And Mae Wan Ho's first book, The Rainbow and the Worm, she called it that because she developed techniques at looking at embryos, for example, fruit fly embryos, through a polarizing light microscope. Polarizing light microscope will show you different colors depending on how the angles of the light are refracted off of something or reflected through it. And she found that if you look at these embryos, which are transparent, that the light from them actually takes on the colors of the rainbow because the water in those embryos is highly organized in definitive structures. And so this was the rainbow within the embryo. The usual methods of biological preparation, when we prepare tissues for slides and whatnot, we destroy these water structures. And so we're not thinking about them. And when you draw the biochemistry on the board in the classroom, then we're looking at the molecules, but we're not thinking about the water. The water is extremely important in organizing how proteins fold, how they're going to ultimately function, and so forth. And so what happens in that water, the processes that are going on in that water, determine chemistry. So it's like one level above typical chemistry. Again, in this coherent state, energy can be transferred theoretically with 100% efficiency and theoretically instantaneously. Now, practically, because of other factors, it never reaches that threshold. But basically, quantum coherent protons and electrons and even light, so-called photons in the body, are all entangled and organized and can transfer energy, but also information, which is a whole another interesting topic, an important topic, the difference between information and energy. Information usually helps to create more negative entropy, and that's different than having more energy. So we can argue that health is not just having more energy, it's having more negative entropy. more structured water, which is lower levels of entropy, which can then carry energy more efficiently. So that is something even in so-called energy medicine and subtle energy circles, there's a lot of confusion. Energy, just having more energy, like charging up a battery, won't give you health. It's how structured is that energy and how we're utilizing that energy. All the energy on a freeway is a lot of energy. All the trucks and whatnot burning gas, creating energy. But one traffic light can control all of that, and that's how the body works. There are enzymes and checkpoints that regulate the flow of energy. And if it's very chaotic and disorganized, we essentially don't have a good control. And that would be the early stages of illness, is when water structures begin to break down, the energy transfer breaks down, the quantum coherence breaks down. We might start to feel fatigued. We might start to feel the early stages. And again, at that point, usually it's not something that is picked up on typical lab imaging that's only looking at the molecules, because we're not looking at water structures in our different testing methods. So this idea of transfer of energy through quantum coherence allows for almost instantaneous transfer of information and energy across large scales of time and space. In fact, Mae Wan Ho argued that life is essentially a quantum state playing a type of jazz over 74 octaves. I think it's a very interesting little metaphor there. Now, curiously, there is evidence for signaling in the brain, for instance, that is faster than neuroelectrochemical signaling, which is the way we think most nerve cells work, is through the so-called action potential and ion flows. Many have argued that is not fast enough to account for consciousness and our consciousness activities. There must be another process going on here, and it could very well be the quantum coherence in the water structures and within structures inside the nerve cells called microtubules, that these can become quantum coherent and transfer energy, especially light energy, very efficiently and very quickly. So, quote from Mae Wan Ho, "At bottom, we, the entire organism, brain and body, are a coherent quantum electrodynamic field that organizes all the genes and molecules." So there's a field-like aspect standing above the chemistry and the genetics, which regulates the chemistry and the genetics. And I think that concept of field is extremely important when you jump to fluid cognition. You're no longer thinking in terms of particles, but fields. So the fluid organism is one level of the field within the so-called human biofield. So conclusions for this lecture, before it gets too long, is that the water fluid cognition gives us knowledge of the fluid body. And we can study this body through the methods of science. And so I spoke about the findings of Gerald Pollack in easy water, and then Mae Wan Ho with the quantum coherence in the water body and the resonant transfer of information and so forth. In part 2 of this section on the fluid organization, I'm going to explore how more traditional medicine spoke about the fluid organization, how they use fluid cognition to perceive it in terms of qualities, damp and dry, for instance, and to speak about how that fits into so-called humoral medicines like ancient Greek medicine, but also classical and traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, and so forth. So that'll all be in part 2. So hopefully this gives you an idea of how, moving to fluid cognition and understanding the fluid organization, we need to start thinking about different laws at work in addition to the normal kind of push-pull interactions we have in the physical body, the mineral body. And again, when we think about how herbs work and vitamins work in something, we have to develop maybe a fluid-type pharmacologic model which takes into consideration energy transfer or information transfer through water structures, in addition to the usual ways we think about how a remedy works, for example, being absorbed through the gut wall into the blood. There's some intriguing evidence that, for example, the microvilli, which are little projections on the cells lining the intestine, they have microtubules and other filaments in them, that they might be acting as sensory organs that are picking up information from the gut. So the entire gut wall is a sensory organ which is conveying information to the nervous system, but throughout the water structures in the body of whatever is in our gut. And so that's maybe a second level for how herbal medicines and other natural products are working. And in those cases, if we want to really make them work more effectively, Turns out we need to actually lower the material amounts of those substances and emphasize the water structures around them so that we can store and hold that information. So it gives us new insight in how we can design new remedies from that way of understanding. Okay, so this has been a bit on the fluid organization. And as always, feel free to subscribe, like, and share this video if you find the content valuable. And please leave your comments below so to let me know if there's any questions around this, things I can explain in more depth, or if there are other topics that people would want to hear me speak about. Thank you for your attention.